Cigar Bar and Lounge. All right, we're ESPN 105.9 The Zone. We're excited to welcome in our friend Ed Werder. 25 years ESPN, been on the Cowboys beat for a long time. He joins us on the Farm Bureau Insurance guest line. Ed, good morning. Where are you?
Good morning. I'm at home in Texas. The Cowboys have been having, their OTAs accessible to the media. Next week they have their mandatory mini camp. And so I've kind of stuck around here. We've got family in town. Our grandson, Henry, who's a devout Cowboys fan, is wanting to celebrate his 10th birthday in Texas, where he was born, and wishes he was raised. And so that's where we are.
Okay. You know what's funny, Ed, is we're SEC football here, and less than 2 hours to Starkville, a little over 2 hours to Oxford, 2.5 to Tuscaloosa, and 2.5 to Baton Rouge. And so we got all four fan bases really big here in central Mississippi. But you know what's always cracked me up is college coaches shut their practices down like it's espionage, and the NFL opens them up. And I've always thought that was wild that, y'all have access and we don't.
There are some limitations, obviously, as far as what we can video, use our phones for and post videos of. And, we can't take photographs in the locker room of players doing interviews. You can only do them out in the hallway when they bring them out. But there's no way to have any measure of secrecy in the NFL, and especially with the Cowboys, because their practice fields are surrounded by, the Cowboys bar at the Star and by Dr. Pepper Keurig, a huge office complex right there where anybody could stand in the window and look out and watch their practices. So there is no secrecy when it comes to Jerry Jones.
So I know you may be immune to it. I'm fascinated with it because, look, I followed the Cowboys just because of proximity and growing up. I remember the last part of Landry, and maybe I remember Staubach, but really more into Danny White. And then, of course, Jerry and Jimmy, and that was my high school and college career. You may be immune to it, and I know I asked you this a few months ago, but I got to go there again. It really is kind of like a controlled, uncontrolled circus, right?
Oh, at all times. I've talked about this. In fact, I spoke to a journalism students broadcast camp the other day at SMU. And one of the campers asked me about what's unique about covering the Cowboys, and I said if you had to attribute it to one person, it's Jerry Jones and his personality and the way, as an owner, he's a general manager, and so unlike any other team in the NFL, after every game, the locker room is closed for 10 minutes while the coaches address the players. Jerry's usually in there with Steven, and they observe, and sometimes Jerry will say something if it's a serious enough situation where he feels that his voice is merited. But after every home game at least, he then walks out of the locker room and makes himself available between so Jerry is standing between where the media is waiting to enter the locker room and the locker room door. And down the hall, 50 yards down the hall, the head coach is doing his, press conference after the game. So you're forced to choose as a journalist, do I want to go into the locker room right away? Do I want to go listen to the head coach, or do I want to talk to Jerry? And by overwhelming numbers, the media talks to Jerry first because Jerry's got all the power. And Jerry's the one who's most likely to say something that will create a headline. Jerry can actually enact anything he talks about, whereas nobody else in the organization really can. And so it's a very unique dynamic after every game. And plus, they're both on the radio multiple times a week answering questions, and it certainly complicates things for whoever happens to be the head coach.
Yeah, it's like a rodeo and a circus and a tent revival. It's just wild to me. And so here you are, you've covered the best of the best. You've had a cool gig forever covering the NFL and the Cowboys. And you got to choose between the head coach and the owner. What would you say is the breakdown over the last X amount of years? Like 50-50, 70-30 to Jerry, and depending on who the coach is at the time? How does that look, you think, the last, 20 years for you, Ed?
I would say 70% go to Jerry, 20% go immediately into the locker room, and those are only people who have somebody else outside monitoring or recording Jerry. If there's a second employee covering the team, that employee usually goes inside into the locker room, and the head coach is left with whatever is remaining, whatever small percentage of people remains. And in fact, I've taken pretty funny photographs of this enormous, mass number of hundreds of media members encircling Jerry Jones, and literally encircling him. Like, people are 3 deep behind Jerry Jones, with extended microphones and so forth. And then to contrast that, I've gone in and taken a picture of like 6 reporters in this huge interview room for Mike McCarthy, Mike McCarthy's audience. And I posted that online, and the PR people don't necessarily love that, but that's the reality. And I think it's for the reason I said. It's that, Jerry has the ultimate power in the organization. Jerry's pretty honest with his feelings after games, and so he's must-see TV to the point that ESPN would hire a crew, like they would have one more crew at a Cowboys game than they would at any other game in the NFL, for the specific purpose of getting Jerry after the games.
Unreal. And you mentioned he and Steven go on Sports Talk Radio damn near every week. I don't know if it's throughout the season or throughout the year, but now which station does more than one station get them, or is there like the Cowboys station? How does that work? That gets them?
No, they're just on with the fan, the official Cowboys station. It's part of the overall agreement the Cowboys have with them, and so they're indirectly paid, obviously, for these appearances. They're accounted for in the contract, whether that particular station says they're paying for Jerry and Steven or they're not. They actually are, though maybe somewhat indirectly. And they're Jerry's on twice a week, every week during the football season, without fail. And even when he threatened a couple of them at one point last year.
I remember that.
I believe in a situation where they lost a lot of games. Obviously, they went 7-10, and they got off to a horrible start. And they obviously had some of the most embarrassing home losses in franchise history last year. A lot of it because of the injuries, but it created circumstances where Jerry was very sensitive about things and actually lashed out at the host for asking what he thought were questions that were unfair coming from the official Cowboys radio station. And he sort of threatened their jobs, and that created, a lot of attention, a lot of headlines and social media reaction.
Yeah, I remember that. Ed Werder, with ESPN for 25 years, been on the Cowboys beat for a long time. He joins us on the Farm Bureau Insurance Guest Line. Now, you may argue that, hey, Bo, he's been like this since I've been covering Jerry. What is your reaction to me saying as he gets older, there's even less filter with Jerry, less of a filter with Jerry?
I don't know. I feel like early on was trying to establish himself, and obviously had, enormous success, both from a business point of view, turning around the franchise into one of the most profitable in the league at a time where they, weren't even selling half their suites, and the home attendance had really dwindled. And, his purchase of the Cowboys was looked at as a folly, even though he only paid $140 million to join this incredibly elite group of NFL owners and control the stadium. And then, they won 3 Super Bowls in 5 years. And, he went through the coaching change with Jimmy Johnson after back-to-back Super Bowls. And so I think at that point, Jerry felt somewhat invincible. And, he was, arguing, he had all kinds of conflict with the NFL over sponsorship agreements. He had Pepsi, they had Coke,
Oh, yeah.
Remember, he had Nike. He brought Nike in and was putting swooshes all over the stadium in defiance of the NFL. So I think Jerry was more renegade when he came into the league than he is now.
Okay.
But certainly he's very sensitive about, not having won a Super Bowl without a team that was at least assembled in large measure by Jimmy Johnson. Obviously, Barry Switzer coached one of those teams to a Super Bowl. But to Switzer's credit, when I've asked him about it, he's always said, "Hey, you got to give me credit for one thing. I didn't screw it up." I mean, some people would have screwed it up. I didn't. At least I didn't screw it up, and that's fair. That's a fair assessment, I think. But yeah, I think so. I think Jerry now is a more reasonable person. But he's also heavily criticized on a constant basis here. People don't think he recognizes the value of the head coaching position, that he makes it difficult, as I said earlier, for his head coaches to succeed. That
No doubt.
He hasn't been active in free agency, early on and paid big money to players. They've been a draft and develop type team. And he's gone 30 years without getting to a championship game or a Super Bowl, and that's the longest, drought in the NFC.
Good grief. Hey, what was it like? Were you covering them with Barry Switzer?
I did cover him. I covered him in 1989 for 1 year. Then I came back in 92, and I've covered him ever since then.
Damn. So you got Jimmy and Barry and then the whole crew since. Okay. What was, I loved Oklahoma as a kid in the 80s with Boz and Holloway.
Yeah.
And they were dominating college football at that time. The SEC really wasn't at that time. And so what was it like to cover Barry Switzer? And were he and Jerry oil and water? Or, I know there was a relationship there.
Well, almost like he did when he made the most recent coaching change and decided ultimately that Mike McCarthy was not coming back. And rather than, that being the story of the moment, Jerry was able to pivot media attention directly, to the fact that he reached out to Deion Sanders the very first day. And he did the same thing artfully back in 93, after the 93 season, when he moved on from Jimmy after back-to-back Super Bowls. Like, I remember covering the whole thing because I was there in the bar when Jerry made the threats about Jimmy that ultimately led to the dissolution of their partnership. And, like the first day after they had their press conference announcing Jimmy was leaving, really the story was, oh no, it's not. The story's not Jimmy's leaving. The story is Jerry's hiring Barry Switzer. Barry Switzer, who retired 5 years ago and has never coached in the NFL and shown no inclination to do so, never aspired to be an NFL coach. He's coming down from Oklahoma. In fact, he's already here. He's cleaning out Jimmy's office. Barry Switzer is the next head coach of the Cowboys. And like you talk about being at one end, of the spectrum with Jimmy, well, Jerry wanted to prove that, as he said, 500 coaches could win Super Bowls with the talent the Cowboys had. So he goes to the other end of the spectrum and hires Barry Switzer. Like there could be more difference in the approach two coaches take to, leading teams and building teams and coaching in the moment than Barry and Jimmy. And it was a ridiculous circus at the time. And Barry was, Barry had no filter whatsoever.
None.
And like, you remember opening press conference, he's physically grabbing Jerry and saying, I'm going to win. I think I'm going to win a Super Bowl. I sure hope I do. And then he grabs Jerry and shakes him in front of everybody. He goes, and you damn sure hope I do. It was crazy. And, you had a whole different way of coaching the players and kind of seemed like they were doing it themselves in large measure. Barry made the back-to-back coaching blunders in Philadelphia, the Dumb and Dumber headlines that came out of that loss. And so, it was probably the biggest circus. And then, the accusations about that Troy Aikman had to address about being, racist, allegations that were made by John Blake, a Switzer assistant he had brought with him. And then Troy got upset about the fact that, he felt like Barry gave it merit because he forced Aikman to address it, at least with him. And so that created, an erosion of their relationship early on. Although I remember Troy telling us, hey, you guys are going to love Switzer, But I think he felt like Switzer didn't have the same competitive edge when he coached the Cowboys as he did when he was running up scores in the Big Ten. Big Eight.
Yeah, that makes sense. Ed Werder, NFL Insider, on the Out of Bounds show, brought to you by Stella Artois and some delicious wings at Martin's in Livingston. These are great. Man, you have been in a spot. You're super talented, and that's why we tracked you down. But it's been like content gold since 1989, and then you coming back in 92 because you just don't ever know. And then this guy hired guys like, Dave Campo and Wade
Gailey.
Phillips and Chan Gailey. What the hell is
Bill
going
Parcells.
on? Yeah.
Bill Parcells.
Oh man.
I know. I said this to the other day to the students that I was speaking to, which is, my timing was impeccable and not totally by chance in coming to Dallas to cover the Cowboys in '89 for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, because you recognize they have a new owner, they have a first-time head coach, they have a new starting quarterback they drafted number 1 overall, and so for me, I was not up against 29-year relationships that Landry and Brandt and Schramm had built with other reporters, and coming in against that, I felt like everybody was kind of starting from square one, and you're on your own to develop your relationships with all the new people. And I did that to the point that I then, left to go to the national and eventually to television, but was smart enough to always stay here, recognizing that the value of covering the Cowboys more than anything else. I appreciate what you said about my talent, and I certainly worked hard and so forth, and tried to break news and create relationships of value and be objective and fair. But the fact that I covered the Cowboys during those times, like when they went 1-15 under Jerry and Jimmy, and then coming back in '92, just as they were about, working for the Dallas Morning News, just as they were about to win 3 Super Bowls in 4 years, the first team ever to do that, and the breakup of Jimmy Jerry in between there. And I was really fortunate that I covered the Cowboys at any time. It certainly added a lot of value to my career, and I wouldn't have had the career I've had, whatever you think of it. I wouldn't have had that without the Cowboys being a huge part of it.
Just a wild, remarkable run with the content gold continuing today, like you said, with them jumping on radio and everything else that they do throughout the year. Ed Werder, NFL Insider on the show. All right, let's switch gears. I could do this for another hour, but George Pickens, well, I'm just fascinated by the whole Jerry, Jimmy, Barry, and then everything else they've done since.
Understandably so.
All right, George Pickens, were you surprised at the move, Ed?
Well, it had been rumored for a while. I think you're only surprised because the Cowboys hadn't made a move at that level since probably they traded, a first-round pick for Amari Cooper in a desperate situation early in Dak's career. And you really didn't know if the Steelers were going to be willing to move on from Pickens. They just acquired DK Metcalf from the Seahawks this offseason, and so it appeared that they were prepared to, for this to be their tandem at wide receiver. And when nothing got done up until the draft, it seemed like the deal was dead, but the Cowboys not having picked a wide receiver obviously felt like that was a significant hole on their roster, and they went out and made this trade. I think it's a good trade. I think, you're worried most not about the guy's ability. You're worried most about a first-year head coach, a first-time head coach, Brian Schottenheimer, and the importance he's attached to creating the right kind of culture in winning. So he's going to have the Cowboys going to have the best culture there is in sports, or at least that's his goal. And then you bring in a guy who, has obviously a lot of red flags in that regard, and that's the reason he's available. The only reason George Pickens is available, not because he's not a good football player, and not because he's not a star wide receiver. It's because of the off-the-field issues and the way he comports himself and interacts with his teammates and coaches, his behavior of, getting a lot of penalties during games, not showing up on time, those sorts of things are obviously detrimental, and then made him available on the trade market. But I think it's a great get for the Cowboys. I think it's certainly worth the risk, and it's certainly worth the risk because they put themselves in a situation where they had to assume this kind of risk if they're going to compete, in their division. I mean, they're the third best team in their division as the season starts. So you got the defending Super Bowl champions in your division, and you got the team they beat to get to the NFC, to get to the Super Bowl and NFC Championship game in Washington, which is, only going to get better as Jaden Daniels, matures and understands the league even better. So you're starting out as the third best team, and they went out and got Deebo Samuel and Laramie Tunsil at left tackle to make their quarterback better. What have you done for your quarterback? And I think the Cowboys did this offseason invest in Brian Schottenheimer and that hire in a way that they did not the previous year when Mike McCarthy was going to be coaching for his job. And now the key to the whole thing to me is, as it's always been, can Dak Prescott stay healthy? McCarthy was here for 5 years. Until then, Dak had never missed a game. First year, he suffers that fractured ankle and leg and misses most of the season. They lose 10 games. Then he's healthy, relatively healthy, and they win 12 games 3 years in a row. And then last year, obviously, gets hurt again, misses 9.5 games, and they lose 10 games again. So to me, it's all about the health of Dak Prescott.
Right.
And giving him an opportunity to succeed by, improving the offensive line with the drafting of Tyler Booker, getting him a second wide receiver so he's not so dependent on CeeDee Lamb. And so, yeah, I think they give themselves a chance in that regard, and now it's all about health and execution.
I think they may have missed their window. I thought they should have loaded the boat around Dak early and midway through his career. In fact, you referenced the year they picked up Amari however many games into the season. Prior to that wide receiver core and even add tight end was – I remember asking Steve Palazzolo with Pro Football Focus where he would rank that group, and he said bottom 3 or 4 in the league prior to the Amari trade, Ed.
Right. Way too many times in Dak's career he's been shortchanged by the front office in their evaluation and roster construction at the wide receiver position. And really – in terms of overall providing dynamic playmakers. I mean, even when they were winning 12 games, they went to San Francisco and lost that first-round playoff game. I mean, the only two dynamic players they really had for the 49ers to fear were Tony Pollard and CeeDee Lamb. And then Tony Pollard got hurt before halftime, and everybody knew the game was over at that point. And so I think they've improved in that area now. Now you've got CeeDee Lamb. Now you've got, George Pickens, who's an elite, big physical wide receiver. You drafted Jaden Blue from Texas, who should be a Tony Pollard type player if he reaches his full potential. And you've got Javonte Williams, a great third down back that you signed from Denver. So I think they've got more pieces in place to be an explosive offense again, and that they'll score 30 points a game or close to it again if Dak stays healthy.
Oh, I hope so. Ed Werder, NFL Insider on the Out of Bounds Show. Ed, we enjoyed it. Thank you so much, man.
Always great talking to you, Bo. Thanks for the opportunity.
One of the best in the business, Ed Werder on the Out of Bounds Show. He joined us on the Farm Bureau Insurance Guest Line. Bundle your auto and home and save with your local Farm Bureau Insurance agent in any of the 82 counties in the great state of Mississippi. We're live in the Bank Plus studio. Don't forget that Mud Bugs is open this weekend. Today all the way through Sunday. Crawfish and shrimp, best in Mississippi.